The last thing John Fillmore saw before they tied the blindfold was the faces of his crewmates, not strangers, men he'd eaten with, slept beside, survived storms with, men who now stood in a silent ring on the deck while the captain read the charges aloud. Fillmore had broken the articles. Specifically, he'd struck an officer during a dispute over rations. Under the code every man aboard had signed, the penalty was fixed, non-negotiable. The crew wasn't asked whether they agreed. They were asked to watch. This is the part of pirate history that gets buried under the romanticized version. Everyone knows about the Jolly Roger. Everyone knows about buried treasure and walking the plank. That last one, incidentally, is almost entirely fictional, a myth with almost no historical basis whatsoever. What nobody talks about is the machinery underneath, the actual system, the psychological architecture pirates built to keep armed, desperate, volatile men pointed in the same direction for months at a time on a wooden ship with no way out. Because here is the problem that every pirate captain faced the moment he took command. You cannot imprison a man on a ship. There is nowhere to put him. You cannot fire him. You're 300 miles from the nearest port. You cannot call the authorities. You are the authority. And the men you're trying to control are carrying weapons. They outnumber you, and most of them chose this life specifically because they rejected every other form of authority that ever existed. How do you govern that? The answer pirates arrived at, through decades of trial and catastrophic error, was a system of control more psychologically sophisticated than almost anything operating on land at the same time. It combined written law, democratic participation, economic incentive, public ritual, and calculated terror into something that genuinely worked, for the captains who understood it and destroyed those who didn't. Let's go inside it. Start with the document, the articles. Every serious student of piracy eventually arrives at the articles, but most accounts treat them as a curiosity, a charming footnote about pirates having rules. That fundamentally misunderstands what the articles actually were. The articles were a social contract. Specifically, they were the only social contract most of these men had ever voluntarily entered. Royal Navy sailors were pressed, kidnapped, legally, off the streets of English port towns and forced into service. Merchant sailors signed contracts under economic desperation with almost no negotiating power. But a man joining a pirate crew read the articles, or had them read to him, before he signed. He was agreeing to specific terms. He knew exactly what the punishments were before he committed any offense. This is not a minor point. It is the foundation of the entire system. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age by any measurable standard, capturing over 400 vessels in a career spanning barely 3 years, had articles that specified punishments with the precision of a legal code: desertion of quarters during battle, death or marooning, theft from a fellow crew member, marooning or death by vote of the crew, striking another crew member aboard ship. Moses' Law, 39 lashes from every man in the crew. That last detail is important. Not 39 lashes from one man, 39 lashes, one from every single crew member. Every man on that ship participated in the punishment. There was no bystander. There was no uninvolved party. Everyone administered the discipline, which meant everyone was implicated in the system, which meant no one could claim the high ground of non-participation. Roberts understood something about collective punishment that modern organizational psychologists still write about. Shared action creates shared identity. When every man on that ship had personally delivered a lash, the punishment wasn't something the captain had done to a crewmate. It was something the crew had done to a member who broke the compact they all lived by. The distinction sounds subtle. The psychological effect was not. But the articles only worked if people believed in them, and belief required enforcement. Which brings us to the office that most pirate histories mention briefly and move on from: the quartermaster. The quartermaster on a pirate ship was not a supply clerk. He was, functionally, a co-captain with a specific mandate: to stand between the crew and the captain. This structure was deliberate. Pirates had a genuine fear of tyranny, not an abstract political fear, but a visceral, personal one rooted in experience. Most pirate crews were built from men who had served under tyrannical naval or merchant captains. They knew what unchecked authority looked like from the inside, so they split the power. The captain held absolute authority in battle. His word was law the moment combat began. Hesitation in a naval engagement meant death, so the chain of command had to be instantaneous and unquestioned during a fight. But outside of battle, the quartermaster was his equal. The quartermaster handled discipline. The quartermaster distributed plunder. The quartermaster heard grievances. If a crew member believed the captain had treated him unjustly, he brought the complaint to the quartermaster. If the quartermaster agreed, the crew voted. Captains were removed this way, not through mutiny, not through violence, but through a formal vote that stripped a man of command and replaced him. It happened with striking regularity. Charles Vane was voted out of his captaincy in 1718 for cowardice in battle by a crew that then elected a new captain in his place and sailed away, leaving Vane stranded on his own ship with a handful of loyalists. The quartermaster system created something psychologically crucial. It gave men a legitimate outlet for grievance. They didn't have to mutiny. They didn't have to seethe silently. They had a process. And that process, paradoxically, made the brutal punishments the articles prescribed more acceptable, because the same system that could deliver 39 lashes could also remove a captain who overstepped. The violence was embedded in a structure that also protected you. That combination of force and fairness is extraordinarily effective at producing compliance. Now here's where it gets considerably darker. For the system to work, it needed what every legal system needs: punishments that people actually feared. And the pirates, drawing from maritime tradition, personal experience, and a certain dark creativity, built a punishment architecture that covered every category of offense with precisely calibrated consequences. For minor offenses, insubordination, neglect of duty, arriving drunk at watch, the standard punishment was a practice called cobbing. The offender was held down and struck across the bare soles of his feet with a flat paddle. It sounds almost mundane compared to what we've already discussed. It was not. The soles of the feet contain an extraordinary concentration of nerve endings. The pain was immediate and total, and unlike flogging, which could leave a man incapacitated, cobbing left the offender able to walk, to work, within hours. The punishment was calibrated to hurt without disabling. You needed the man functional. You needed him afraid. Those were not mutually exclusive goals. For moderate offenses, theft, fighting aboard ship, repeated insubordination, the cat-o'-nine-tails came out. But the administration of the cat on a pirate ship differed from Royal Navy practice in one significant way. The Navy flogged men in private or in front of assembled crew as a formal ceremony. Pirates often administered the lash as an immediate response, within minutes of the offense being confirmed. The speed was intentional. There was to be no gap between the act and the consequence, no time for the crew to process it abstractly. The punishment happened publicly, immediately, and then it was over, and the ship moved on. Edward Lowe, and Lowe remains the standard by which pirate brutality is measured, the man who crossed lines that made other pirates uncomfortable. Lowe used a variation that was his own invention. He called it the woolding. A cord was looped around the offender's head and twisted tight with a stick, a tourniquet applied to the skull. It caused blinding pain without permanent injury. Lowe used it specifically for crew members he wanted to punish but keep alive and working. It was efficient. It was horrible. It was Lowe. There is a punishment that deserves more attention than it typically receives. Historians of piracy note it and move on. That is a mistake. It was called the sweat. The condemned man was placed in the hold of the ship, below decks, in the dark, in the heat, and the entire crew would take turns filing past him in a circle while musicians played continuously above. The crew moved fast, almost running. As each man passed the prisoner, he was permitted, required, under some captains, to jab the prisoner with a knife, a pin, a sail needle, or a sharpened stick. Small wounds, dozens of them, hundreds of them, depending on the size of the crew and the duration of the punishment, which could last hours. The sweat was not designed to kill. It was designed to produce a specific psychological state, not just pain, but helplessness. The constant movement of the crowd, the noise, the darkness, the inability to predict where the next strike would come from or how severe it would be. Survivors of the sweat, documented in Admiralty trial records from the period, consistently described it as more psychologically damaging than any single physical punishment. The body healed from the punctures within days. The disorientation took longer. Charles Johnson documented the sweat in his 1724 history, noting that several pirate captains used it specifically for informers, men suspected of planning to report the crew to naval authorities. The psychological targeting was deliberate. The message was not just pain. The message was, we know what you're thinking of doing, and this is what happens before you do it. But the most sophisticated element of the entire pirate discipline system was not any individual punishment. It was the public ritual surrounding the punishments, the theater of it. When a man was to be flogged or cobbed or subjected to Moses' law, the procedure followed a specific sequence. The ship's bell was rung. The entire crew assembled on deck, not suggested, not encouraged, required under the articles. The charges were read aloud by the quartermaster. The accused was given the opportunity to speak. The vote was taken if one was required, and then the punishment was administered in complete silence, with the entire crew watching. The silence was part of it. No jeering, no commentary, no crowd energy to hide behind or perform for. Just the sound of the sea and the sound of the punishment. Every man standing in full awareness of what they were witnessing and why. This ritual served three simultaneous functions. First, it legitimized the punishment. The process had been followed. The accused had spoken. The crew had participated. Second, it educated. Every man watching was receiving a live demonstration of exactly what a specific violation cost. Third, and most importantly, it created memory. Not second-hand accounts, not warnings. Actual witnessed memory of consequences, stored in the body as visceral experience rather than abstract information. Researchers studying deterrence have found consistently that the certainty and immediacy of punishment matter more than its severity. A certain, immediate, witnessed consequence changes behavior more reliably than a severe but distant or abstract one. The pirates, without any access to this research, had arrived at exactly the same conclusion through empirical experience. Their punishment rituals were optimized for memory formation in ways that would make sense to a modern behavioral psychologist. Not every element of the system was about punishment. Here is the part that rarely makes it into discussions of pirate discipline because it complicates the simple narrative. The articles that prescribed brutal punishments also guaranteed rights that most working men of the 17th and 18th centuries had never experienced. Every man's vote counted equally in major decisions, not in proportion to rank or wealth or experience. One man, one vote. The cook voted alongside the captain. The newest recruit voted alongside the boatswain who'd sailed 20 years. Plunder was distributed by formula, fixed in the articles, non-negotiable. The captain received a larger share, typically 2 shares to everyone else's 1, but the formula was known in advance and applied without exception. There was no mechanism by which the captain could secretly take more. The quartermaster counted the plunder with witnesses present. Men injured in service were compensated from the common fund before the remaining plunder was distributed. Bartholomew Roberts' articles specified exactly. A lost right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, a left arm 500, a right leg 500, a left leg 400, an eye 100, a finger 100. These weren't gestures. They were insurance payouts, calculated and contractually guaranteed. This combination, brutal punishment for violations, genuine protection and equality for compliance, created a system that was, in the lived experience of many crew members, more just than anything they had known before. Men who had been pressed into naval service, underpaid on merchant vessels, subject to the unchecked cruelty of captains with no recourse, found in piracy something they hadn't expected, something that felt, in its own violent way, fair. That fairness is what ultimately made the discipline system work. Not the fear alone. Fear without fairness produces resentment, and resentment on a ship full of armed men produces mutiny. The captains who relied solely on terror, Lowe being the clearest example, found that their crews were in constant states of barely suppressed rebellion, that loyalty evaporated the moment a better opportunity appeared, that the men who served them did so only because leaving was more dangerous than staying. Roberts' crews, by contrast, were documented by captured sailors and naval officers as operating with something closer to genuine cohesion. Men who sailed under Black Bart described a ship that ran with efficiency and shared purpose. The violence was real, the punishments were severe, but the system around them was consistent, transparent, and applied equally regardless of who you were. Roberts himself was killed in battle in 1722, shot by grapeshot from a Royal Navy vessel while reportedly standing on his quarterdeck in full dress, his finest clothes, as if he'd decided that the manner of his death should match the standard he'd set for everything else. His crew, taken prisoner that same day, were tried in the largest piracy trial in history. 52 men were hanged. Every single one of them had signed the articles. They knew the cost when they signed. They signed anyway. Because for the years they'd spent on those ships, operating inside that brutal, democratic, terrifying fair system, they had lived by a code of their own choosing, in a world that had never offered them one. That, in the end, is what the discipline system was really about. Not control from the top down. Something stranger and more human than that. A group of desperate men trying to build, in the only place left to them, something that resembled justice. It just looked, from the outside, a lot like fear.